A lonely widow prepares for a reconciliation dinner, unaware that her daughter-in-law plans to poison her. But the plan is interrupted by a desperate scream that exposes the poison before the first spoonful. What was meant to be a family reunion turns into an eruption of secrets, betrayal, and irreversible downfall. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. And now, on with the story. The echo of Claire's footsteps rang through the empty halls of the mansion like a lonely lament. At 72, she walked with the same elegance she always had, but every movement carried the weight of a solitude that grew heavier each day. The burgundy velvet curtains, which had once framed smiles and lively conversations, now served only to filter the light that insisted on pouring in, as if trying to awaken a house that preferred to sleep. She stopped before the portrait of her husband, Robert, hanging on the main wall of the living room. His serene blue eyes gazed at her with the same tenderness as 40 years ago, when they had built this life together. The fortune he had left remained untouched, guarded like a treasure she protected not out of greed, but out of the responsibility she felt to honor his memory. Outside, the sound of an approaching car broke the silence. Claire sighed deeply. She recognized the sound of that sputtering engine. It was Edward, her only son, arriving once, again with that defeated look she'd learned to recognize from a mile away. Edward parked the old beat-up car in the mansion's circular driveway, a brutal contrast to the imposing estate. At 45, he carried on his shoulders the weight of every dream that had crumbled. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his worn-out tie, trying to maintain some dignity in front of the mother who had always been his safe harbor. Inside the house, Megan, his wife, watched everything from a second-floor window. Her dark eyes glinted with a calculating coldness that she hid very well when necessary. At 42, she had married Edward, believing he would be her ticket into high society. What she found was a weak man, incapable of even keeping a business afloat. She descended the stairs with measured steps, each movement designed to create the desired impact. Megan knew exactly how to use her beauty and charm when needed, but inside she was seething with anger and frustration. All her plans were falling apart, and it was the fault of this man who couldn't even convincingly ask his own mother for money. Edward walked through the front door, and Claire greeted him as she always did, with a smile that tried to hide the constant worry she felt for her son. She immediately noticed the deeper dark circles under his eyes, the unshaven face, the suit that desperately needed pressing. Her heart ached. In the kitchen, Rose was preparing afternoon coffee with her usual dedication. At 55, she had worked in this house for over 2 decades, since Edward was a young man full of promise and Megan had not yet entered their lives. Rose knew every corner of the mansion, every one of Claire's moods, and she could read between the lines of everything that happened there. She watched Edward's arrival through the small kitchen window and felt a pang in her chest. Rose had seen that boy grow up, cheered for his victories, and suffered with his defeats. Now she saw a broken man, and it saddened her deeply. But what bothered her most was Megan. From day one, Rose had sensed something strange about that woman, a coldness disguised as politeness that had never fully convinced her. The sound of voices reached the kitchen. Edward was trying to explain once again the company's difficulties, the mounting debts, the relentless pressure from creditors. Claire listened patiently, but Rose could tell from her boss's tone that she was tired of hearing the same story over and over. Megan joined the conversation with that practiced smile Rose despised so much. She spoke in a sweet voice, but her words were as sharp as razors. She insinuated that perhaps Claire could help one more time, that it was for the good of the family, that Edward just needed one last chance to get back on his feet. Rose continued making the coffee, but her ears were tuned to every word. She knew Claire well, enough to know that she was reaching her limit. She had helped Edward countless times, always hoping he would finally find his way. But each attempt resulted in more failure, more debt, more excuses. The afternoon dragged on, tense with forced conversations and silences heavy with meaning. Edward avoided his mother's gaze, knowing he had disappointed her yet again. Megan kept up her act as a devoted daughter-in-law, but Rose saw how her eyes flashed with anger when she thought no one was looking. When they finally stood up to leave, Claire hugged her son with the strength of someone who fears it might be the last time. Edward returned the hug but quickly pulled away, ashamed of his own weakness. Megan gave her mother-in-law a polite peck on the cheek, but Rose saw how her lips tightened in a look of disguised disgust. After the couple left, Claire stood at the door, watching the car drive away. Rose approached gently, offering a shawl to protect her from the chilly afternoon wind. That night, Claire couldn't sleep. She walked through the empty house, remembering the times when Edward was a happy child, full of dreams and possibilities. Where had she gone wrong? How had that brilliant boy become such a lost man? And why did she feel that something much worse was about to happen? Across town, in a small run-down apartment, Edward and Megan argued late into the night. Her words were venomous, blaming him for the whole situation, for his weakness, for his inability to get what was, in her opinion, rightfully theirs. Edward tried to defend himself, but the words died in his throat, choked by the shame and exhaustion of a life that seemed to have lost its meaning. 3 weeks had passed since their last visit, and Edward could no longer hide his desperation. Sitting at the small kitchen table in their apartment, he stared at the piles of overdue bills spread out before him like soldiers in a lost war. Each envelope brought a more serious threat than the last. The company he had tried so hard to build had shut down for good last week, taking with it the last remnants of his dignity. Megan walked into the kitchen with her cell phone glued to her ear, gesturing nervously as she spoke to someone. Her voice had a sharp edge that Edward had learned to fear. When she hung up, her eyes were red with rage. "That was the bank," she said, slamming the phone down on the table. "They're going to foreclose on the apartment next week. 1 week, Edward. And you're just sitting there, staring at those damn bills like they're going to solve themselves." Edward's stomach churned. The apartment was the only thing they had left, a small refuge in the midst of the chaos his choices had created. Without it, they would literally be on the street. I can try to negotiate for more time," he mumbled, but his own voice sounded weak and unconvincing. "Negotiate?" Megan laughed bitterly. "With what money? What collateral? Don't you get it, Edward? It's over. We have nothing left to offer." She moved closer to him, her eyes shining with an intensity that frightened him. "Nothing, except your mother and that fortune she guards like it's her divine right." Edward instinctively recoiled. There was something in Megan's eyes he didn't recognize, a coldness that went beyond justified anger. "Megan, we've tried. She's not going to help us anymore, and maybe she's right. I've wasted every chance she gave me." "That she gave you?" Megan's voice rose an octave. "Edward, you're her only heir. That money should be ours by right. But she'd rather leave it locked away, untouched, like it's some shrine to her dead husband. It's pure selfishness." At the mansion, Claire walked through the gardens Robert had loved so much, trying to find peace among the roses he had planted with his own hands. Rose watched her discreetly from the kitchen window, worried about how pale her boss looked. Since Edward's last visit, Claire seemed to be carrying an even heavier weight on her shoulders. The mansion's phone rang, interrupting the afternoon's tranquility. Rose answered with her usual courtesy, but her expression quickly changed. It was Edward, and his trembling voice on the other end of the line made Rose's heart sink. "Rose, I need to speak with my mother. It's urgent," he said, and Rose could hear the desperation he was trying to hide. Claire came to the phone, and the conversation that followed was painful to witness. Edward pleaded, his voice breaking with every word, explaining about the foreclosure, about having nowhere to live, about having tried everything. Rose saw tears well up in Claire's eyes, but she also saw the determination in her posture. "My son," Claire said, her voice firm but filled with sadness, "I can't anymore. I've helped you more times than I can count. Each time you promise it will be different, but nothing changes. You need to learn to be responsible for your own choices." On the other end of the line, Edward felt his world collapsing. "Mum, please, I'm not asking for the business. It's just so we're not on the street. Megan has nowhere to go, and "Edward," Claire interrupted him, her voice as heavy as lead, "you can..." Both come live here for a while until you get on your feet, but I can't give you any more money. That's my final decision." The silence that followed was sharp. Edward knew Megan was listening to everything, and he could see the fury building on her face like a gathering storm. When he hung up the phone, she exploded. "Live with her?" Megan screamed, her eyes blazing with hatred. "Like we're beggars asking for a handout. As if I would ever agree to live under her roof, listening to her snide remarks, being treated like an intruder in my own family." Edward tried to calm her down, but Megan was beyond reason. She began pacing the room, gesturing violently, her mind working at a dangerous speed. "She has millions stashed away, Edward, millions, and she'd rather see us destitute than help us. What kind of mother does that to her own son?" Megan stopped suddenly, turning to him with an expression that chilled him to the bone. Unless she's no longer a problem." "What are you talking about?" Edward asked, but a part of him already feared the answer. "She's old, Edward, 72, anything could happen. An accident, a sudden illness." Megan let the words hang in the air, watching her husband's reaction. Edward felt sick to his stomach. "Megan, stop it, you can't be serious." "Why not?" she shot back, her voice now dangerously calm. "She's condemning us to misery out of sheer stubbornness. Why should we suffer while she lives like a queen in her castle, surrounded by luxuries she doesn't even use?" That night, Edward couldn't sleep. Lying next to Megan, he could hear her controlled breathing, but he knew she was awake, plotting. What she had suggested was monstrous, unthinkable. But as the hours passed and he thought about the reality that awaited them, the street, hunger, total humiliation, a dark part of his mind began to consider the unthinkable. Megan, for her part, had already made her decision. She was not going to live like a pauper because of some selfish old woman's stubbornness. If Claire didn't want to share the fortune in life, then they would have to find another way. She began searching discreetly on her phone, looking for information she never imagined she would seek. Each page she visited took her deeper down a path of no return. The next day, while Edward was out making another desperate attempt to negotiate with creditors, Megan made a call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was rough, suspicious. It was a contact she had gotten through shady acquaintances from her single days, people she never thought she'd have to deal with again. "I need something," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Something that will solve a problem, permanently, but it has to look natural, like an act of fate." The response came with precise instructions and a price she accepted without hesitation. In 2 days, she would have the solution to all her problems in her hands. Claire didn't know it, but her death sentence had already been signed by a daughter-in-law who had completely lost her humanity to greed and desperation. 2 days later, Megan received a small package with no return address. It was carefully wrapped in brown paper, and inside was a single dark vial, the size of a common medicine bottle. With it was a small note with precise instructions. 3 drops in any hot liquid. The taste will be unnoticeable. Symptoms begin in 15 minutes and resemble a natural cardiac arrest. She tucked the vial into the bottom of her purse, her hands shaking slightly. It was the first time she had held something so final, so irreversible. But when she thought of all the years of humiliation, all the sleepless nights spent counting bills they couldn't pay, all the times Edward came home defeated and without prospects, her resolve hardened. Edward arrived home that afternoon, looking more dejected than ever. His last attempts at negotiation had failed miserably. One of the creditors had been particularly cruel, reminding him that men like him were pathetic, failed heirs who couldn't even take advantage of the opportunities life handed them on a silver platter. "How did it go?" Megan asked, though she already knew the answer from his defeated expression. "Bad," Edward mumbled, collapsing into the old, worn-out armchair. "Really bad. They're done talking. It's a matter of days before we lose everything." Megan approached him slowly with the care of a predator stalking its prey. "Edward, do you remember what we talked about yesterday? About your mother condemning us to this situation?" Edward raised his head, alerted by the tone of her voice. "Megan, I hope you're not thinking about..." "About what? Solving our problems?" She knelt before him, taking his hands. "Honey, your mother is 72. At her age, anything can happen. And if..." If something were to happen naturally, we would inherit everything. We could start over, live with dignity. You're talking about letting my mother die? Edward tried to pull his hands away, but Megan held them tight. Not letting, she said, her voice hypnotic. Helping nature along. She's old, alone, suffering from loneliness. Maybe it would even be a release for her. A chill ran down Edward's spine. The woman he had married was suggesting something his mind refused to fully process. This is insane, Megan. She's my mother. And that's exactly why you should want her suffering to end, Megan insisted, her words poisoned with a twisted logic. Did you see how she looked during our last visit? Sad, lonely, living on memories? And us? We have our whole lives ahead of us, but she'd rather see us in poverty. Edward tried to stand, but his legs felt like lead. The desperation of the past few months had eroded his ability to think clearly. Every night he went to sleep with humiliation burning in his chest, imagining what his father would think of him if he were alive. Robert had always been an upstanding, successful, respected man. And him? He was just a walking failure. How would you even... Edward stopped, unable to complete the sentence. Just forming the question made him feel as if he were betraying everything he believed in. Megan smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I've already looked into possibilities. There are ways to make it look natural. A heart attack, for example. At her age, no one would question it. You've looked into it? Edward stared at her in horror. Megan, for God's sake, what have you become? I've become a woman who refuses to live in poverty when there's an obvious solution, she replied coldly. Your father worked his entire life to build that fortune. It should be ours, Edward. Your mother has no right to condemn us to suffer out of stubbornness. That night, Edward lay awake until dawn, wrestling with thoughts he never imagined he would have. His mother's image smiled at him from the photographs scattered around the apartment, but slowly that image was replaced by visions of a life without debt, without humiliation, without the pitying stares of people on the street. Megan slept placidly beside him, as if she hadn't just suggested the unthinkable. But Edward knew she wasn't really asleep. He could feel the tension in her body, her mind working through the details of a plan that became more real with every passing minute. At the mansion, Claire couldn't sleep either. She walked through the dark hallways, stopping in front of the room that had been Edward's as a child. The walls still had a few faded posters of football teams and rock bands. How had that cheerful boy full of dreams turned into the broken man, who had come begging for help? Rose, ever attentive, heard her boss's footsteps and went downstairs to make some tea. She found Claire sitting in the library, flipping through an old photo album. Tears streamed silently down her face as she looked at pictures of Edward at various ages, his first day of school, his graduation, his wedding. Claire, Rose said softly, you shouldn't be up at this hour. I can't sleep, Rose, Claire admitted. I feel like something terrible is about to happen. It's a strange feeling, like the air is heavy before a storm. Rose sat beside her, something she normally wouldn't do, but which years of intimacy made natural. Do you want to talk about what you're feeling? It's Edward, Claire sighed. When he called yesterday, there was something different in his voice, a desperation that goes beyond financial trouble. And Megan, there's something about her that worries me, Rose. Something I can't quite put my finger on, but it makes me uneasy. Rose nodded. She felt the same way about Megan, but had never said anything so as not to worry her boss further. Do you think they'll agree to come live here? I hope so, Claire replied, closing the album. It might be the last chance I have to get my son back, to make him remember who he really is before it's too late. But across town, Megan was finalizing a plan that would make any chance of reconciliation impossible. She had called Claire earlier, her voice sweet and regretful, suggesting a reconciliation dinner for the following week. She said that she and Edward had reflected on everything, that they understood her mother-in-law's position and wanted to apologize properly. Claire, ever hopeful when it came to her son, accepted immediately. She even suggested she cook herself, preparing the vegetable soup Edward had loved as a child. Megan almost smiled as she accepted the suggestion. It would be perfect. The hot liquid would mask any strange taste, and the soup had always been Edward's favorite. It would be almost poetic in a macabre way. The week passed in a blur of anxiety and preparation. Megan mentally rehearsed every move she would make during the dinner, every word she would say, every expression she would wear. The dark vial remained hidden in her purse, waiting for the right moment like a loaded gun. Edward, meanwhile, lived in a state of moral numbness. He hadn't exactly agreed to Megan's plan, but he hadn't done anything to stop her either. This silence ate away at him like acid. He tried to convince himself he was just letting fate run its course, but deep down, he knew his inaction made him just as guilty as she was. On Friday, the day of the dinner, Claire woke with a strange feeling in her chest. She had dreamed of Robert, who told her to be careful, to protect herself from something that was approaching. She tried to push away these dark thoughts, focusing on the joy of having her son home again. Rose arrived early that day, wanting to help with all the preparations. She had noticed Claire's excitement all week and didn't have the heart to spoil this rare moment of happiness for her boss, but something in her gut kept her on alert, a sense of danger she couldn't explain. "Rose, could you run to the grocery store after lunch and pick up some spices?" Claire asked, checking the pantry. "I want the soup to be perfect, just like Edward liked it when he was a boy." "Of course. Claire, what time are they getting here again?" Rose asked, organizing the kitchen utensils. 6 o'clock. Megan said they're coming straight from Edward's work. Claire paused for a moment, frowning. "Though I don't understand what work that would be, since his company closed." Rose found that odd too, but didn't comment. She had learned over the years that some observations were best kept to herself. During the afternoon, Claire set the dining room table with her usual care. She used the fine china Robert had brought back from a trip to Europe, the crystal glasses that sparkled like diamonds under, the chandelier's light. Every detail was meant to show Edward that he would always be welcome in this house. Meanwhile, Megan dressed with meticulous care. She chose a navy blue dress that made her look respectable and repentant, applying light makeup to feign a vulnerability she was far from feeling. In the mirror, she practiced expressions of remorse and gratitude she would use throughout the evening. Edward watched her from the back of the room, sitting on the bed with his head in his hands. "We can still call this off," he mumbled without looking up. "We can go there, talk to her honestly, accept her offer to live at the mansion until we get back on our feet." "And live like parasites?" Megan turned to him, her eyes flashing. "Edward, tonight all our problems will be over. Tomorrow we'll be free, rich, respected. All we have to do is not screw this up." "What if Rose suspects something?" Edward pressed, looking for any excuse to postpone the inevitable. "Rose is an old, naive housekeeper. She won't notice a thing." Megan turned back to the mirror, adjusting an earring. "Besides, you said she always leaves after dinner is served. We'll have complete privacy." At 5:30, Rose finished tidying the kitchen and prepared to leave. It was her habit to leave the house in order after Claire had guests, so she could enjoy their company without worrying about chores. But that day, something made her hesitate. "Claire, are you sure you don't want me to stay?" Rose asked, watching her boss stir the soup on the stove. "I can help serve." "No need, dear," Claire replied with a smile. "I want it to be an intimate family gathering. You deserve to rest after all the help you've given me today." Rose nodded, but her stomach was in knots. She picked up her purse and headed for the door, but stopped in the hallway. An inexplicable inner voice warned her not to leave. After more than 20 years of caring for this house and this family, she had learned to trust her instincts. Instead of leaving, Rose went silently up to the second floor where her small room was located. Officially, she didn't live at the mansion, but Claire had insisted she keep a space there for when she needed to stay late or sleep over during an emergency. At 6 o'clock sharp, Edward and Megan arrived. Edward was pale and sweating, while Megan wore a radiant smile plastered on her face. Claire greeted them with genuine joy, hugging her son for a long time and welcoming her daughter-in-law cordially. "How are you both?" Claire asked, leading them into the living room. "Megan, you look lovely in that dress." "Thank you, Claire. You look radiant as well." Megan forced a blush. We're doing well. Actually, we wanted to talk to you about everything that's happened." Edward remained silent, watching his mother with a painful intensity. Every wrinkle on her face, every grey hair, every loving gesture seemed to be etching itself into his memory, as if it were the last time he would see them. Upstairs, Rose spied discreetly from a hallway window. She could see the silhouettes of the three of them in the living room through the sheer curtains. Something about the scene bothered her, but she couldn't put her finger on it. The conversation over appetizers was strained. Megan skillfully steered the discussion, talking about regret, about understanding Claire's position, about wanting to rebuild their family relationship. Edward just nodded along, unable to articulate words that weren't lies. Claire, moved by what she believed was a genuine reconciliation, decided it was time to serve dinner. "I'll go get the soup," she announced, standing up excitedly. "Edward, you're going to love it. It's the same recipe from when you were little." Megan offered to help, following Claire to the kitchen. "Let me help, Claire. It's the least I can do after everything." In the kitchen, Claire stirred the soup with motherly affection, reminiscing about Edward's childhood. Megan watched her every move, calculating the perfect moment. When Claire turned to get the bowls from the cabinet, Megan quickly pulled the vial from her purse. Her hands trembled slightly as she uncapped the dark glass. 3 drops, that's all it would take. 3 tiny drops that would change everything forever. She approached the pot, her heart pounding. At the exact moment she tilted the vial over the soup, the back door opened silently. Rose had come down the service stairs, driven by a premonition she couldn't ignore. She had intended to grab something from her purse, which she'd forgotten in the kitchen. What she saw left her frozen in horror. Megan leaning over the soup pot, pouring something from a small, dark vial. The liquid fell into the soup with an almost imperceptible sound, but it echoed in Rose's ears like thunder. For a second that felt like an eternity, the two women stared at each other. Megan went completely pale, the vial still in her hand, caught in the most heinous act imaginable. Rose, her eyes wide with terror, instantly understood what she was witnessing. The scream that tore from Rose's throat ripped through the mansion's silence like a siren. "Claire, don't eat it. There's poison in the soup." Rose's scream echoed through the mansion like a bell tolling a tragedy. In the living room, Edward felt the blood freeze in his veins. Those words, "there's poison in the soup," were the confirmation of what he had desperately tried to deny to himself. Megan had actually done it, and he had let her. The sound of his footsteps racing down the hall toward the kitchen mingled with the crash of something being dropped. When Edward burst through the kitchen door, he found a scene that would be forever seared into his memory. His mother, her back to the stove, still holding a spoon inches from her lips, her eyes wide with confusion. Rose, leaning against the wall, her face as white as a sheet, pointing with a trembling hand toward the pot. And Megan, frozen beside the stove, still clutching the small dark vial. "Mom!" Edward yelled, lunging toward Claire and gently knocking the spoon from her hand. The utensil clattered to the floor with a metallic ring that seemed deafening in the tense silence that followed. Claire looked at her son, then at her daughter-in-law, then at Rose, trying to process what was happening. Her mind, always sharp and organized, seemed unable to connect the pieces of this macabre puzzle. What is Rose saying?" Claire asked, her voice a rough whisper. "Poison? What poison?" Megan dropped the vial, which shattered on the floor, scattering small shards of glass and traces of a dark liquid. Her mask of the repentant daughter-in-law had completely crumbled, revealing an expression of animalistic panic. I didn't... That's not..." Megan stammered, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "Rose must be mistaken. I saw you," Rose shouted, her voice choked with emotion. "I saw you pouring that stuff into Claire's soup with my own eyes. How can you deny it?" Edward looked at his wife, searching, her eyes for any sign that this was a misunderstanding, a terrible mistake. But what he found was guilt, panic, and worse, the fury of someone caught red-handed. "Edward," Megan turned to him, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "You know I would never do something like this. She's confused. She didn't see clearly." But Edward couldn't look away from the floor, where the shards of the vial mixed with the dark liquid. The reality of what had almost happened hit him in successive waves, each more devastating than the last. His mother had almost, because of him, because of his weakness and his silence. Claire, leaning on the kitchen counter to keep from falling, watched the scene as if in a nightmare. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together. The sudden dinner invitation, Megan's insistence on helping in the kitchen, Edward's strange nervousness all evening. "You," Claire began, her voice gaining strength as the reality crystallized in her mind. "You tried to poison me, in my own home, with the soup I made for you with love." "Claire, please, let me explain." Megan took a step toward her mother-in-law, but Rose moved between them, shielding her. "Boss, don't you come near her," Rose ordered, her voice firmer than it had ever been in that house. "Don't you dare!" Edward finally looked up, and Claire saw something in his eyes that made her recoil. It wasn't just guilt or regret. It was the confirmation that he knew, that he had let this happen. "Edward," she said, her voice breaking. "Did you know?" The silence that followed was more eloquent than any confession. Edward opened and closed his mouth several times, but the words seemed to have gotten lost somewhere between his throat and his shattered conscience. "Answer." "Me?" Claire screamed, and for the first time in 20 years, Rose saw her boss completely lose control. "Did you know your wife was going to try to kill me?" I didn't," Edward began, but his own voice betrayed him, coming out weak and guilty. "Mum, I never wanted it to come to this." "Never wanted it to," Claire repeated, incredulous. "But you knew it could." Megan, realizing Edward was about to confess everything, tried to regain control. "This is ridiculous. You're making a mountain out of a molehill over a misunderstanding. Rose saw something that wasn't—" "Shut up!" Claire whirled on her daughter-in-law with a fury Rose had never witnessed. "Shut up! I opened my home to you, treated you like a daughter, and you tried to kill me for my money." "Your money?" Megan laughed bitterly, her last attempt at maintaining appearances evaporating. "You think that money is yours? Robert worked his whole life to build that fortune, and it should belong to his son, but you'd rather hoard it like a greedy old miser, watching us struggle." "Megan," Edward finally managed to speak, horrified by the cruelty of his wife's words. "What?" She turned on him, her eyes blazing with hatred. "It's the truth. You're too weak to say it, but someone had to have the guts to solve this problem. She was condemning us to poverty out of pure stubbornness." Rose watched in shock, seeing the woman who had always pretended to be polite and respectful reveal her true monstrous nature. Claire backed away further, pressing against the wall, her hand on her chest as if trying to contain a heart that felt like it would burst. The betrayal was more painful than any poison. It wasn't just Megan, it was Edward too, her own son had conspired against her life. "Get out of my house," she said, her voice turning deathly cold. "Both of you. Now." "Mom." Edward tried to approach, but she held up a hand, stopping him. "Don't call me Mom. A mother is someone her son can trust, and I clearly can't trust you." The tears finally began to stream down Claire's face, but her posture remained erect, dignified even in her pain. "You have disappointed me in a way I never thought possible." "Claire," Rose approached carefully, "we should call the police." Megan grew even paler at the word police. "You can't prove anything. It's a housekeeper's word against mine." "The pieces of the vial are on the floor," Rose replied coolly, "and I'm sure the police can analyze what's left of the liquid." Edward looked at the debris at his feet and knew it was over. His life, his family, his dignity, it had all shattered along with that vial, and the worst part was knowing he had let it happen. He had been too cowardly to stop it, too weak to confess, and now it was too late for anything but regret. "Please," he whispered to no one in, particular perhaps to his mother, perhaps to God, perhaps to the time he could never get back. "Please forgive me. But some things, once broken, cannot be fixed, and some betrayals are too deep for forgiveness." The distant sound of sirens began to cut through the night silence, rapidly approaching the mansion. Rose looked at Claire with a silent request for confirmation, and the matriarch gave an almost imperceptible nod. The housekeeper had made the call during the chaos, following a protective instinct that had developed over decades of caring for that family. "You called the police?" Megan asked, her voice rising an octave. You couldn't have done that, Rose. You don't understand the situation. I understand perfectly, Rose answered, with a firmness that surprised even herself. I understand that I saw one person trying to poison another. That's called attempted murder. Edward felt his legs grow weak. Reality was materializing around him like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake. The sound of the sirens grew closer, and with them came the confirmation that there was no going back, no more excuses, no more pretending this wasn't happening. Mom, he tried one more time, his voice broken. I know, I was wrong. I know I failed you in an unforgivable way, but please let me explain. Explain what? Claire turned to him, and Edward flinched at the icy fury in her eyes. Explain how you two planned my death. Explain how you sat in the living room while your wife prepared poison to kill me. Explain how you were going to inherit my money and pretend to mourn at my funeral. Each word was like a slap, and Edward felt he deserved every one. Tears began to stream down his face, but they were tears of self-pity that only made him look more pathetic in the eyes of everyone present. Megan, realizing the situation had completely spiraled out of her control, began pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. You don't understand. You don't know what we've been through. The debts, the creditors, the threats. We were desperate. So that justified killing your mother-in-law? Rose asked, incredulous. Money. You were going to kill a person for money? It wasn't a person, Megan exploded, her mask of civility finally gone for good. It was a selfish old woman who'd rather hoard a fortune she didn't even use. Robert built that wealth for his family, not for it to collect dust in bank accounts. The ensuing silence was broken by the sound of heavy knocking on the front door. The sirens were right outside now, and the flashing red and blue lights began to flood the mansion's windows. Rose, Claire said, her voice trembling but still authoritative. Go answer the door. And bring them in here. Rose left quickly, leaving the three of them alone in the kitchen. The tension was so palpable, it felt suffocating. Edward looked back and forth between his mother and his wife as if searching for a miraculous escape he knew didn't exist. Edward, Claire said, her voice filled with an infinite sadness, I want you to look at me. He reluctantly raised his eyes, and what he saw was even more devastating than any scream or accusation. It was pure disappointment, a deep pain that went far beyond the recent betrayal. It was the look of a mother watching her son transform into something unrecognizable. You weren't like this, she continued. The boy I raised, who played in these gardens, who hugged me when he had nightmare, where did he go, Edward? Where did my son go? Edward felt something break inside his chest. It was as if she were declaring the death of the person he once was, and he knew she was right. The man standing in that kitchen was no longer the son she had loved. He was a stranger who had allowed greed and desperation to turn him into a monster. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hall announced the arrival of the police. 2 investigators entered the kitchen, followed by Rose, who immediately positioned herself beside Claire in a protective gesture. Good evening, said the older investigator, a middle-aged man with an experienced air. I'm Detective Miller, and this is Detective Davis. We received a report of an attempted poisoning. Rose stepped forward. I'm the one who called. I caught this woman, she pointed at Megan, pouring poison into the soup that Claire was about to eat. Megan tried to speak, but Detective Miller held up a hand, signaling for silence. His experienced eyes scanned the scene, noting the broken glass on the floor, the dark liquid, the expressions of guilt and panic on the faces of those present. Ma'am, he addressed Claire, can you tell me what happened? With a dignity that impressed even the seasoned officers, Claire recounted the night's events. Her voice was steady, but laced with a pain that made every word heavier. When she finished, the silence in the kitchen was deafening. Detective Davis had already begun photographing the scene and collecting evidence. The shards of the vial were carefully gathered, along with samples of the spilled liquid. Mrs. Megan Donovan, Detective Miller turned to her. Do you have anything to say? This is a misunderstanding, Megan screamed, her composure finally shattering completely. I would never do something like this. It's a housekeeper's word. Against mine. You can't arrest me based on the word of a housekeeper. Actually, the detective replied calmly, we have physical evidence and an eyewitness. That's more than enough. It was when Edward saw the handcuffs being removed from the officer's belt that the final reality hit him. Megan was going to be arrested. His life as he knew it was over, and all because of a greed that had consumed them from the inside out. "Megan Donovan," Detective Miller began, "you are under arrest for attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent." "No," Megan screamed, struggling as Detective Davis approached with the handcuffs. "You can't do this to me. I didn't do anything." But as the cuffs were snapped onto her wrists, something in Megan broke for good. The reality that she was going to be arrested, tried, and likely convicted hit her like a hammer. And as she always did when she felt cornered, she attacked the person closest to her. "It was his idea too," she shrieked, turning on Edward with a savage fury. "Coward! You knew everything. You agreed to everything. It was your plan too." Edward went even paler, if that was possible. Detective Miller's eyes turned to him with renewed interest. "Is that true, sir?" the officer asked. "Were you aware of the plan to poison your mother?" Edward opened his mouth, but no sound came out. How could he confess that he had been too cowardly to stop it, but also too cowardly to actively participate? How could he explain that he had allowed it to happen simply by doing nothing? "Edward," Claire said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Answer the officer." And it was in that moment, under everyone's gaze, that Edward finally found a sliver of belated courage, the courage to admit his guilt. "Yes," he whispered, "I knew." The silence that followed was broken only by the sobs of Megan being led away by the officers, screaming accusations and curses that echoed through the mansion's halls like harbingers of a storm that was just beginning. Edward's confession hung in the kitchen air like a death knell. Detective Miller watched him for a long moment, analyzing his expression, weighing his words. Technically, Edward had admitted to complicity in attempted murder, but there was something in his defeated posture, in his eyes filled with genuine remorse, that made the officer hesitate. "Mr. Donovan," the detective began, "are you confessing to active participation in the planning of this crime?" Edward looked at his mother, searching for some sign, some hope in her eyes. But what he found was a coldness he had never seen before. Claire was no longer his protective mother. She was a victim looking at her attacker. I knew about the plan," Edward admitted, his voice breaking. "But I didn't actively participate. I should have stopped it. I should have told my mother. I should have been man enough to say no, but I was a coward." Detective Davis whispered something in his colleague's ear. They exchanged professional glances, communicating without words. Finally, Detective Miller nodded. "Mr. Donovan, you are not being arrested at this time, but you will be subpoenaed to give a statement. I recommend you find a lawyer," the officer paused, "and that you think very carefully about your choices." Edward felt a mixture of relief and terror. He wasn't being arrested right now, but his life was destroyed either way. He looked at his mother, hoping for, what? Forgiveness? Understanding? But Claire had distanced herself from him physically and emotionally, as if his very presence were toxic. After the police left, taking a still screaming Megan with them, the mansion was plunged into a silence as heavy as lead. Rose had cleaned up the broken glass and the spilled liquid, but the kitchen still held the sinister energy of what had happened there. Claire remained standing, leaning against the counter, watching her son as if seeing him for the first time. Edward couldn't meet her gaze, but he couldn't leave either. He was trapped between a desperate desire for redemption and the certainty that it was too late for anything. "Mom," he began, but she cut him off with a wave of her hand. "No," Claire said, her voice so low it was barely audible. "Don't call me that. You've lost the right." The words hit Edward like physical blows. "Please, let me explain." "Explain what?" Claire turned to him, and Edward saw that her hands were trembling with restrained rage. "Explain how you sat there knowing your wife was going to kill me. Explain how you plan to inherit my money and go on with your life as if nothing had happened." "It wasn't like that," Edward shouted, finally finding his voice. "I never wanted it to come to this. I was desperate, out of options, with no way out. You don't understand the pressure I was under." Pressure? Claire laughed, but it was a bitter, humorless sound. What pressure justifies planning your own mother's death? What desperation is great enough for that? Rose watched in silence, her heart breaking as she saw this family destroy itself before her eyes. She had seen Edward grow up, had rooted for him, had suffered with his failures, but this was indefensible. "Edward," Claire continued, her voice gaining a terrible strength, "I want you to get out of my house now, and I want you to never come back." "Mum, no." Edward tried to approach, but she recoiled. "Get out!" Claire screamed, and her voice echoed throughout the entire mansion. "Get out of my house!" Edward began to cry, thick tears of despair and self-pity. "I have nowhere to go. I've lost everything. The apartment is being foreclosed on. I have no money, no job." "You should have thought of that before you conspired to kill me," Claire replied coldly. "Your consequences are your own, not mine." The raw reality hit Edward like a runaway train. Without Megan, without his mother, without money, without a home, he was utterly alone in the world. For the first time in his life, there was no one to blame, no one to save him, no one to solve his problems. "Rose," Claire turned to the housekeeper, "please escort this man to the door, and make sure he takes only what he brought with him tonight." Rose nodded sadly. Even hurt by Edward's betrayal, she felt a pang of pity for him. But her loyalty was with Claire, and always would be. Edward walked to the mansion's front door like a condemned man walking to the gallows. Each step echoed through the halls that were once his home, past furniture that held his childhood memories, leaving behind a life he could never reclaim. At the door, he turned one last time. "Mom, Go away," Claire said without looking at him, "and don't come back. You're dead to me." The door closed behind him with a final, definitive thud. Edward stood in the circular driveway, staring at the old, beat-up car that was now his only possession. The cold night wind cut through his clothes, but it was nothing compared to the chill in his heart. Meanwhile, at the city's detention center, Megan was processed and taken to a temporary cell. The reality of prison hit her with full force. The cold walls, the smell of disinfectant mixed with human despair, the clang of doors slamming shut. "Phone," she demanded of the guard. "I get one phone call." But when she picked up the receiver, Megan realized there was no one to call. Her parents had cut ties with her years ago after a series of fights over her manipulative personality. The few friends she had were superficial, people who tolerated her only for the social connections Edward provided. And Edward was just as guilty as she was, even if he was too much of a coward to fully admit it. Rage began to boil in her chest. How had it come to this? How had she sunk so low? All she had ever wanted was what she considered her right, a comfortable life, a respectable social standing, financial security. Was that so much to ask? In the next cell, an older woman, clearly a veteran of the prison system, watched the newcomer with interest. "First time?" the woman asked. Megan didn't answer, but her expression was enough. "Attempted murder is serious business," the woman continued, "especially when it's family. Judges don't like that stuff. You're going to get a heavy sentence." "Shut up," Megan mumbled, but her voice had no force. "Just giving you a heads up," the woman shrugged. "Family is sacred to judges. So is killing for money. You managed to combine the two. Congratulations." Megan lay down on the hard, narrow cot, trying to block out her cellmate's words. But they echoed in her mind, mixing with the reality that she could spend decades in. Here. Decades away from luxury, away from comfort, away from everything she considered important in life. Outside, Edward drove aimlessly through the city streets. The gas tank was nearly empty, and he had only a few coins in his pocket. The apartment would be seized in the morning, and he no longer had the keys even if he wanted to go back. He pulled into a 24-hour gas station and went into the restroom. Looking at himself in the dirty mirror, he saw a man he didn't recognize, unshaven, with red, swollen eyes and a wrinkled suit. Where was the confident businessman he had once been? Where was the beloved son who had grown up in that mansion? When he got back to his car, he noticed the station attendants watching him. They had seen his disheveled appearance, his defeated posture, and probably considered him a potential threat. Edward felt a new, sharp humiliation, being seen as a suspect, as someone dangerous, when in reality he was just a completely broken man. That night, he slept in his car, parked in a deserted lot. He woke up cold, hungry, and with the terrible certainty that this was only the beginning of his fall. 6 months had passed since that fateful night, and Edward had discovered a depth of suffering far beyond what the human mind can imagine. The first few days were a blur of denial. He slept in his car, showered at gas stations, and convinced himself it was all temporary, that he would soon find a solution. But reality is relentless with those who have fallen. The car was towed in the second week, when he could no longer pay for parking. His clothes were stolen the first night he slept on a park bench. The suit that once symbolized his social status became dirty rags that barely covered his increasingly thin body. Hunger was his first lesson in humility. Edward, who once chose between fancy restaurants, learned that leftovers from a dumpster taste like survival. He learned that begging requires a daily death of one's pride, that each coin tossed his way carried the weight of pity or disgust from the person who threw it. The cold of the winter nights pierced his bones like needles of ice. He discovered there are different kinds of invisibility, that of the rich who are ignored by choice, and that of the destitute, who are ignored out of discomfort. People averted their eyes when they saw him, as if poverty were contagious. But the physical suffering wasn't the worst part. It was the mental anguish. During the long, sleepless nights, shivering under the awnings of foul-smelling buildings, Edward relived that night over and over. He saw his mother's face transform from love to horror, heard the sound of the vial shattering, and smelled the soup that had almost become his first crime. Guilt ate away at him like a cancer, not just for the attempted poisoning, but for all the years of disappointment, lies and failures that had led to that moment. Every dollar his mother had lost on his failed businesses, every tear she had shed in silence, every hope he had destroyed with his incompetence. In his 3rd month on the streets, Edward contracted a pneumonia that nearly killed him. Feverish and delirious, he was found unconscious by veteran homeless men who took him to a makeshift shelter under an overpass. There, among men and women who had also lost everything, Edward learned that dignity doesn't come from a bank account, but from how we treat each other at rock bottom. A man named Joe, a former accountant who lost everything to a gambling addiction, took care of Edward during the worst of his illness. "The street teaches you," Joe said one night, sharing a tattered blanket. "It teaches you that whether you're a rich man or a poor man, we all bleed the same color. And we all have to answer for our choices eventually." Edward started working at intersections, washing windshields for change. The work was humiliating, but there was something therapeutic in the act of cleaning, as if each repetitive motion were a small attempt to wash the filth from his soul. During those months, he learned from overheard conversations that Megan had been sentenced to 25 years in prison. The news brought him no relief or satisfaction, only a profound sadness at how 2 human beings could so completely destroy each other. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Claire was living through her own torment. The house, once quiet by choice, was now silent with emptiness. Rose did her best to cheer her up, but they both carried the weight of what had happened within those walls. "Claire," Rose said one afternoon, finding her boss once again standing at the window, overlooking the estate's entrance, "you need to eat something." "I'm not hungry," Claire replied, and Rose noticed she had lost a lot of weight in recent months. The trauma of the betrayal had left deep scars, not just emotional but physical as well. "You're thinking about him again." It wasn't a question. Claire nodded slowly. "Rose, do you think I did the right thing, kicking him out like that?" "Claire," Rose chose her words carefully, "what he did was terrible, unforgivable, but he was still your son." Tears began to stream down Claire's face. "I couldn't look at him, Rose. I couldn't see my little boy in the man who had conspired to kill me, but now I wonder if that wasn't exactly why he needed me." By the 6th month, Edward was unrecognizable. He was rail-thin, with a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, and his beard and hair were long and matted. But there was something different in his eyes, a clarity born of suffering, a deep understanding of his failings, and a desperate need for reconciliation. He knew he was sick, perhaps gravely so. He felt a growing weakness, frequent dizzy spells, and a sense that his time was running out. That's when he made the decision that would change everything. On a cold autumn morning, Edward managed to borrow a pen and paper from an elderly woman who frequented the same spot where he begged. With trembling hands, he wrote a letter filled with 6 months of regret, longing, and belated love. The walk to the mansion nearly killed him. Every step was a battle against the weakness that consumed his body. When he finally reached the property's gate, his strength was gone. Carefully, Edward folded the letter and tucked it into the gate in a spot where he knew it would be found. Then, too exhausted to go on, he collapsed right there on the cold ground at the entrance. That's how Claire found him the next morning, unconscious, unrecognizable, but still her son. And in that moment, seeing the broken man who had once been her greatest joy, Claire understood that a mother's love is stronger than any betrayal, deeper than any wound. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Claire, Edward, and Rose has touched your heart. If you were moved by this family's journey of pain and possible redemption, torn apart by greed, please leave a like, subscribe to our channel, and tell us in the comments what part of the story resonated with you the most. Every day, we bring you intense stories like this one, which reveal how family love can be tested by the worst moments of human life, showing that sometimes we need to lose everything to discover what truly matters. We'll see you in the next episode with another narrative that will stir your emotions and make you reflect on the power of true repentance and the possibility of a new beginning even when all seems lost forever.